Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. I am in the process of making pollen patties at the moment. When I've not got someone to hold the bags for me, I've made a little jig to get them held open for me while I do the job. So earlier today I did a video making sugar syrup for the coming good weather. With the spring on us, coming on us now, or at least a glimpse of it coming up on us right now, I'm going to be preparing my hives for rapid growth. Now, I've been through most of my hives, almost all of them now, and I've had very good survivorship, between 90 and 95% survivorship so far. So things are shaping up well for me to have a good production of nukes this year. But in order for those colonies, particularly those smaller ones, to be big enough to split, I've got to make sure that they start growing, and growing at the earliest opportunity. The ways you can do that are making sure they have plenty of food and making sure they get started early. And so I'm going to get them started relatively early with pollen substitute, several weeks before they're likely to be getting it from the wild. But in this way, if I give them pollen substitute, they start to produce young. The risk with giving pollen substitute too early in the season is the colony outgrowing its supply of honey. And so I've also got to be sure that, number one, there's either enough honey in the hive or that I can feed them plenty of sugar syrup. Now, as the weather forecast is looking like 50 degrees plus on 6 out of the next 10 days, maybe even 60s, then I'm confident that I can get some sugar syrup into those bees during that time. And so even those that might have been marginal in terms of whether they had enough honey, they should have enough by the time I've given them some sugar syrup. So the sugar syrup will stimulate growth, pollen patties will stimulate growth. So that's what I'm doing. That's my plan. I may not be able to get around to all of my hives to give them this, but I'm going to give it a good shot. Certainly I know I'm not going to hurt them as long as I've got plenty of food resources in there. So my plan is to make as close to 100 of these as I can, but actually I'm making them pretty big, so if I need to, what I can just do is cut them in half and give some more later on. This will be roughly £1 pound in each one. This little jig that I made is just a couple of bits of wood and a piece of a milk carton that I cut into a bit of a slide. So that way both holds the bag and points the food in the right direction at the same time. The things you got to do when there's just one of you doing this job. After I'm starting to get some volunteers who are going to come and get some experience with me this spring. So I think by May I should have some helpers on hand as well. Now, other spring jobs, as well as feeding sugar syrup, which I'll do, and as well as feeding pollen, then you've got the question of when do I take my bee cozies off? So the bee cozies, at least in the single story hives, they're not in the way for my activities. I can go around all these single story hives and get the get my food put in there I don't have to worry about putting it in between supers or anything. But having said that, also, even in my multi-story hives where I've got 2 brood chambers, most of the brood activity right now will be going on in that top brood chamber. So really, I only need to get these pollen patties on the top, and that's going to be right where I want it, just above the brood chamber. So for now, I'm going to be leaving my bee cozies on the hive because I don't want them to, we're going to get cold nights, we're going to have more cold days, and there's no rush to make it harder for the bees to keep the hive warm by taking the insulation off. So I will leave that insulation on until such time as I need to go down into the brood chamber below the upper brood chamber. And that means at the time when I'm thinking about reversing the brood chambers. Now, reversing the brood chambers, let me just show you over here. Reversing the brood chambers is when you've got, let me make some room first. So reversing the brood chambers is a way of giving the bees more room to expand into. Right now, the majority of my 2-story hives will have the cluster of bees up here, leaving behind lots of empty comb down here. And the reason being is they followed the food up the colony and they're eating the food up here, and right now they're rearing brood up there, and so they're going to be stuck in that position. But they will be slow to move down into this lower brood chamber because it's colder down here. The heat is up in the top of the hive. It's hard to force the heat down here, but by default the bees will expand here as the weather gets warmer, and as the colony cluster outgrows this area, it will start to move down into there. But it's slow. And so under the right conditions, what we can do is take this box and put it on top, and put this box and put it down below. So what's the advantage of that? Is that the heat from this cluster full of bees down here moves up, gets all this space nice and warm, and the queen very quickly starts to go up and lay in all those empty combs. Now there's a risk to doing that. If the weather is not going to be warm enough, or if that cluster is not big enough, what will happen is that the heat will be lost from this lower cluster. Once you move it down here, the heat will be lost into this upper box, which they haven't had to heat before. Now they've got to heat 2 boxes instead of 1. That means they have to contract to keep warmer around that brood. If we have some cold weather, they've got to contract, and that could mean that the brood around the outer edges of that brood chamber can start to get chilled and die. So you must only do this under 2 circumstances. 1, the cluster has to be big. It has to pretty much fill that upper brood chamber. And number 2, the weather forecast wants to be appropriate. You want for the next week that weather to be at least not going down to freezing at night, preferably in the mid-40s or warmer at night, and for the daytime temperatures to be in the 50s or 60s. If you do this when the conditions are wrong, you'll end up with chilled brood. That chilled brood can end up in leading to things like European foul brood under stressful conditions like that, etc., chalk brood, all sorts of problems. But if you have a big cluster, and if the weather forecast allows it, then you can reverse the brood chambers and your colony will grow extra fast. That's the point at which I'll be putting pollen patties between the 2 brood chambers, so it's right in the middle of where the brood's going to be. So let's get back to making some pollen patties. So, the point at which I feel it's appropriate to reverse the brood chambers, that's the same time at which I'll probably be going in to take my bee cozies off the hive. Typically here in Maine, that wouldn't be until maybe the first week in May. Sometimes, some years we could easily do that in the middle of April. Other years it may be middle of May before you can do it. But it also depends on what you need to do and that weather forecast. And of course, every colony will be different, because the bigger the colony, the earlier you can do it. The smaller the colony, the smaller the cluster, the less the need to do it, and the more careful you've got to be, because it can only generate so much heat. So I am very much looking forward to getting back in amongst the bees. I see lots of folks down south. I watch other people's videos as well, and I enjoy watching what's happening to other folks in warmer climates than mine, and I can just sit here enviously wishing the weather was warm here as well. But there's no point in wishing life away. I wish you good luck, and you folks down further south from us. We're still having to combat the elements here, but still, for those of you in the climates like Maine, or even cooler than Maine, hang in there. The spring is coming. We can see signs of it here in Maine. As I showed in a previous video, this pollen substitute is a mixture of a couple of different pollen substitutes plus some 2-to-1 sugar syrup. So the 2-to-1 sugar syrup is wetted it, and I've mixed the two types of pollen substitute to give a broad spectrum of protein in there, and it makes quite a decent pollen patty. It certainly helps boost the brood production. I had a comment from somebody who's clearly made more pollen patties than myself, and they recommended, instead of using 2-to-1 sugar syrup, use high fructose corn syrup. The reason that the 2-to-1 sugar syrup is, he reckons, less good is because these patties will dry out. Unless you make them damp enough, these patties will dry out and go hard. And once they go hard, the bees won't touch them. And according to this guy, using corn syrup instead of sucrose syrup, in other words sugar, it results in a much more pliable, softer patty which doesn't dry out. And I'm going to try that. I've ordered myself some corn syrup. Yes, I know there's questions as to whether corn syrup's good for the bees. I think in moderate doses it's going to be okay. But I'll try some out and see the comparison, because I totally agree. If these patties dry out, they end up like a little bit of like a solid rock, and the bees won't touch them. So when I make some patties next week, I'm going to be making them with high fructose corn syrup, and hopefully I'll have an even more pliable consistency, which stays pliable as well. So I'm learning all the time. I hope you found that useful. Spring is coming, so the jobs I'm getting done now, making sugar syrup, making my pollen patties, getting ready to build up my brood. Remember to use caution if you're building up the brood, because you can lead to a hive starving to death. So do not overdo it unless you understand what you have to do to keep the colony well fed during that time, and the weather's going to allow you to do that. I'm going to be not taking my cozies off until I see sustained good weather and I see the opportunity to start reversing the brood chambers in the hive. That's not going to be usually much later than the first week of May, but hopefully I'll be doing videos on that during April. At least with my strong hives I will. I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. See you next time.